Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher bachar b'nviim tovim v'ratza b'divreihem hanemarim be'emet Baruch atah Adonai habocher b'Torah u'v'Moshe avdo u've'Yisrael amo u'b'nviei ha'emet v'tzedek. Vayahi ish echad mitzara mishpachat hadani u'shmo Manoach ve'ishto akara ve'lo yalada ve'yara malach Adonai el ha'isha ve'yomer aleha hinenat akara ve'lo yaladat ve'harit ve'yaladat ben ve'ata hisham rina ve'al tishti yain ve'shechar ve'al tochli kol tameh ki hinach hara ve'yaladet ben umora lo yale al rosho ki nazir Elohim yeh hanar min habatan vehu yachel lo hoshiyat Yisrael miad plishtim vetavo ha'isha vatomer lehoshiyat Yisrael miad plishtim vetavo ha'isha vatomer laisha lemor ish ha'elohim ba'elai umorehu kemareh malach ha'elohim noreh me'od ve'lo shelitihu aymizehu ve'et shmo lo higid li vayomer li hinach hara ve'yaladet ben ve'ata al tishti yain ve'shechar ve'al tochli kol tuma ki nazir Elohim yeh hanar min habeten ad yomoto ve'yatar Manoach al Adonai ve'yomar bi Adonai ish ha'Elohim asher shalachta yavon ha'od aleinu ve'yareinu manaseh lanar hayulad ve'yishma ha'Elohim be'kol Manoach ve'yavo malach ha'Elohim od al ha'isha ve'hi yoshevet basadeh u'Manoach isha ein ima v'temaher ha'isha v'tarat v'tagid la'isha v'tomer elav hine nira elai ha'ish asher bavayom elai ve'yakam ve'yalach Manoach acharei ishto ve'yavo el ha'ish ve'yomer lo hata ha'ish asher dibarta el ha'isha vayomer ani vayomer Manoach ata yavod varecha ma Adonai משפט הנער ומעשהו. ויאמר מלאך אדוני אל מנוח מכל אשר אמרתי אל האישה תשמור. מכל אשר יצא מגפן היין לא תאכל, ויין ושחר על תשת וכל טומאה אל תאכל, כל אשר ציוויתיה תשמור. ויאמר מנוח אל מלאך אדוני נעצרה אותך ונעשה לפניך גדי עזים. ויאמר מלאך אדוני אל מנוח אם תעצרני לא אוכל בלחמך, ואם תעשה עולה לאדוני תעלנה, כי לא ידע מנוח כי מלאך אדוני הוא. ויאמר מנוח אל מלאך אדוני משמח כי יבוא דבריך וכיבדנוך. ויאמר לו מלאך אדוני למה זה תשאול לשמי והוא פלי. ויקח מנוח את גדי העזים ואת המנחה וילחצור לאדוני ומפליע לעשות, ומנוח ואשתו רואים. ויהי בעלות הלהב מעל המזבח היא שמיימה, ויעל מלאך אדוני בלהב המזבח, ומנוח ואשתו רואים, ויפלו על פניהם ארצה. ולא יסף עוד מלאך אדוני להרעו אל מנוח ואל אשתו, אז ידע מנוח כי מלאך אדוני הוא. ויאמר מנוח אל אשתו מות נמות, כי אלוהים ראינו. ותאמר לו אשתו לא חפץ אדוני להמיתנו, לא לקח מידנו עולה ומנחה, ולא הרענו את כל אליה, וכעת לא השמיענו כזאת. ותלך האישה בן, ותקרא את שמו שמשון, ויגדל הנער, ויברכהו אדוני. ותחל רוח אדוני לפמו במחנה דן, בין שרה ובין אשתאול. ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם, צור כל עולמים, צדיק בכל הדורות, האל הנאמן, האומר ועושה, המדבר ומקיים, שכל דבריו אמת וצדק. Ne'eman atahu Adonai Eloheinu v'ne'emanim dvarecha v'davar echad medvarecha achur lo yashuv reikam ki el melech ne'eman v'rachaman ata baruch ata Adonai ha'el ha'ne'eman bechol devarav Rachem al Tzion ki hi beit chayinu ve'luvot nefesh toshia bimhera beyameinu baruch atah Adonai misameach Sion bevaneha Samchenu Adonai Eloheinu Beliahu Hanavi Avdecha Umalchut Beit David Meshichecha Bimhera Yavo V'yagel Libeinu Al Kiso Lo Yeshev Zar Ve'lo Yinchalu Od Acharim Ve'et Kvodo Ki V'shem Kodshecha Nishbata Lo Shelo Yichba Nero Leolam Va'ed Baruch atah Adonai Magen David Al HaTorah Ve'al Avodah Ve'al HaNevi'im Ve'al Yom HaShabbat Hazeh Shenatata Lanu Adonai Eloheinu L'Kdusha Ve'lachmeinu Ve'lachvud Ve'ulitifaret Al hakol Adonai Eloheinu anachnu modim lach u'marchim otach yiparash shimcha befi kol chai tamid leolam va'ed baruch atah Adonai mikadesh hashabbat
Amen. Simen tov, mazel tov, mazel tov, simen tov, mazel tov, mazel tov, simen tov, mazel tov, mazel tov, simen tov. Yehelanu, 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 lechol Yisrael. Yehelanu, yehelanu, lechol Yisrael. Yehelanu, yehelanu, lechol Yisrael. Yehelanu, yehelanu, lechol Yisrael.
Mazel tov, mazel tov. We're going to invite Zachary to read his Devar Torah that he worked very carefully on for the benefit of all of us to hear now.
Shabbat Shalom. This week's Parsha Nosah has the themes of quarantine and Birkat Kohanim, the priestly blessing. The reason why the theme of quarantine stuck out to me is probably quite obvious. Over the past 2 years, we have all experienced being in quarantine, which made reading this feel very familiar. The Torah describes something like leprosy, which was very contagious, and for us, it's COVID-19. It's weird that we can relate to something that Bnei Israel had to deal with 3,200 years ago. We still use the same way of isolating ourselves from other people today to stop the spread of disease. I found this very interesting because science and technology have come so far to the point where cars can drive themselves and people can go into space and back like they are taking an airplane, but quarantine is still used as the main method to contain a disease to stop it from spreading. The Torah tells us of 3 types of quarantine. The first is for people with a skin disease, the second for people with oozing wounds, the third for people who came in contact with the dead. Today, our quarantines are for people who have tested positive for COVID. Another theme is the Birkat Kohanim, or the priestly blessing. The Birkat Kohanim is when the Kohanim take off their shoes, get their hands washed, and bless the congregation on the bima. I know this so well because as a Kohen, I've had the chance to make this blessing with my Zaidi, dad, and brother. This blessing is also said now on Shabbat when the parents bless their children. I am very happy that Nosah is the parsha for my bar mitzvah. As a Kohen blesses, I am blessed every Shabbat by my parents, so I feel a connection to this. I begin to wonder why the parents' blessing for their children is a section of the priestly blessing said by the Kohanim. I found out that before the temple was destroyed, their Birkat Kohanim was said every day, and I believe parents say it every week as a compensation since the temple was destroyed. It is meaning for us because it is our parents saying the blessing instead of the Kohanim, and we know our parents much better than the Kohanim. This makes the blessing just as meaningful. Shabbat Shalom.
There is a stark contrast that emerges from this morning's Torah portion, and perhaps the best way of understanding this is with a little bit of trivia. And that is, does anybody know, as a general rule, when the Mishkan, the tabernacle, was dedicated in the desert? Don't feel bad. It's Rosh Chodesh Nisan. And most people also don't know when Solomon's temple was dedicated, the Beit Rishon, the first Beit HaMikdash, and that was over Sukkot. But unquestionably, everyone knows when the second temple was rededicated. Hanukkah. There's an important lesson to learn from this, and the reason why, Zach, the idea comes to my mind is because your Torah portion not only mentions the word Hanukkah, but also the Torah portion that your life now will be entwined with forever is part of the parasha that we read for Hanukkah. And that is because as important as dedication is to something, it doesn't compare to rededication. And that is not merely applying yourself once to something, but applying yourself day in and day out to understanding the importance of things that develop in our life. As children, we are brought into this world, and I know unquestionably it was true for you. We are brought into this world by loving Jewish parents with the hope and dedication that we will grow into our Jewish lives. One of the reasons why I deeply believe the bat mitzvah, the bar mitzvah, is such a signal, liminal moment in our lives is because it is a moment where we teach ourselves about rededicating ourselves to something that was given to us before. I pray, and I suspect this is the hope and prayer in the hearts and minds of those who love and care for you, that you will walk from this moment understanding just how beautiful the act of rededication can be in every day in your life. So it is my honor to present to you some gifts on behalf of the congregation to remind you of that. I'm going to ask Zach to join his parents. And along with me, they will recite the bar mitzvah blessing, Baruch, Sheptorani, Me'ansho, Shalzeh, Shehechianu, Vikiyamanu, Vihigianu, Lazman Hazeh. Give a hug and a kiss. Mazel tov. Mazel tov. I'd like to ask everyone if you could kindly rise as we'll now recite prayers on behalf of the State of Israel and a prayer for Canada. For the honor of these prayers, I would like to call upon Sarah Urowitz and Abby Urowitz. Come. Right here. Who's doing Canada? Canada first. Oh, Canada. Right here.
Our God and God of our ancestors, we ask your blessings for the people of Canada, for its government, for the members of its armed forces serving in safety and danger here and abroad, and for all who exercise just and rightful authority. We ask to teach them insights of your Torah that they may administer all affairs of state fairly, and that peace and justice and freedom may forever abide in our midst. May this land under your providence be an influence for good throughout the world, uniting all people in peace and freedom, and helping them fulfill the versions of your prophet. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they experience war anymore. And let us say, Amen.
Avinu Shabashamayim, Sur Yisrael v'go'ala, Barach et Medinat Yisrael, Reshit Tzmichat Gulatenu. V'hagen alaha be'evrat chazdecha, ufros alaha sukat shlomecha, ushlach orcha v'amidcha, l'rasheha, tzareha v'yoatzeha, v'taknem be'etzah tova milfanecha. Chazek et yedei meginei eretz kochenu, v'hanchilem Eloheinu, Yeshua ve'ater nitzachon ta'atrem. V'natata shalom ba'aretz, v'simchat olam le'yoshveha, v'nomar, Amen.
Please remain standing. Bottom page 254. Excuse me, 354.
Hallelujah, et Shem Adonai, ki nizkav et Shemo levado. Oh, no one
Page 360.
Uvenuchon yomar, Eitz Chaim hi, Lama chazikim ba, V'tomcheha meyushar deracheha darcheno v'chol netivoteha shalom hashivenu Adonai elecha v'nashuva Chadesh Yameinu 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 Chadesh Yameinu Kekeden.
You may be seated. Shabbat Shalom and Mazel Tov, everyone. In the last century, inarguably one of the greatest Talmudists of the past 500 years lived. If you are married, or if you are soon to be married, you probably know his name. And that is because when it came time for you to choose the text of your ketubah, maybe I or some other rabbi probably told you that you had the option to get the one with the Lieberman clause. Imagine that for a moment. There's this 2,200-year-old document, and this man who lived not 100 years ago manages to have his name added to it. His name was Shaul Lieberman. He grew up in Eastern Europe. As a child, he was an Eloi, a child prodigy, and he grew up into being a genius. And by a young age, he had proven that he had memorized the entire Talmud, all 63 volumes, about 5 million words, 2,711 pages. And the story that is told about Lieberman, of a student who he bumps into years later at the Jewish Theological Seminary, some 20 years after he graduates. And Lieberman says to him, "What brings you back here?" And the student says to him, "I came here because I'm completing my PhD." And Lieberman says, "And what did you do your work in?" And the student says, "I did it in the Bible." And Lieberman says, "Such a small book. After all, the Torah is only 300,000 letters, a little less than 80,000 words, and yet it has so much to tell us." This past week, an old friend of mine, himself an Ethiopian Jew, sent me the picture of the arrival of 181 Ethiopians who came this week to Israel with the word mitmashech, which in Hebrew means it's still happening. They were part of a project over the past 6 months of bringing 3,000 people who have arrived, effectively taking whatever remained of the Jewish community there over to Israel. We think we know truths, and we do. But there are truths that need to be repeated over and over again because we not only forget them, but even worse, we take them for granted. And one of the most remarkable truths is the State of Israel was founded not merely to establish a Jewish homeland and protect its citizens within its borders, but the other truth is Israel has a mission to all the Jews in the world. Now, the story of those Ethiopians who stayed behind always seemed less compelling than those who chose to leave. Because those who had chosen to leave also chose to brave the long, arduous, frightening march out of Ethiopia into southern Sudan in the face of marauders and rapists and murderers and disease and thirst and hunger. In 1999, when they did that, they deserved our attention. But every abandoned Jewish community in the world always seems to have a few that stay behind. We call them, in Hebrew there's a word, they're called kapturim, which means switches. As in they're the ones who are left behind because they will be the last ones to turn the switches of the lights off. But those Ethiopians and the remnants of the separated families and relations came to Israel because they faced ever greater persecution outside there in Ethiopia. Now in 2014, when Russia invaded the Ukraine for the first time, the Russian-backed rebels took over Donetsk and controlled the airport. When word of this reached Israel, they organized a clandestine evacuation of hundreds of Jewish families over back roads, night convoys, flights from one city to another before bringing them over to Israel. They did this for the same reason why they did it for the Ethiopians, because they know all too well that when a society disintegrates, that the Jews suffer first and worst. This, of course, has played itself out over again this year, that whatever strength was left of the post-World War II Ukrainian Jewish community is now forever gone, with nearly 20,000 Ukrainian Jews in Israel. The only ones left there are the switches. The same is true for a little piece of seldom appreciated history amongst European Jews, but by no means is it less painful. This past week marked what was known as the Farhud, or the beginning of the mass expulsion of Jews from Arab lands. In 1948, murderous pogroms exploded throughout the Middle East and Arab countries, leading to the exodus of nearly 1 million indigenous Jewish Arabs out of their countries. From Arab countries like Morocco to Iraq and everywhere in between. Some of those communities dated back to more than 2,600 years ago, and in an instant they vanished, except for the few who remained behind. For the many, they had no money or the ability to get out, and so it was the fledgling state of Israel who set up operation centers in Turkey and in Malta and in Cyprus to rescue them. And they did this all at the same time that they were bringing in refugees from the displaced person camps after the Shoah. And at the same time, they were assembling an army and arming themselves for the eventual invasion of the Arab armies in 1948. All in the same year. And I thought of this because this past week I read that the chief rabbi of Moscow, Pinchas Goldschmidt, had left Moscow on some official business about 8 weeks ago, and he is now officially working in exile because he had come under pressure by the Russian authorities because he refused to support the war in the Ukraine. And where did Pinchas Goldschmidt go for refuge? Israel. To understand how remarkable this is, as to how unprecedented this is in Jewish history, you do not have to look far back at all. Walk through Yad Vashem's Garden of the Righteous and ask yourself, why did all those Jews in Europe have to rely on the kindness and sacrifice of their non-Jewish neighbors for protection and survival? The stories, of Varian Fry and Oskar Schindler and Irene Sendlerova are rightly inspiring to us and moving, but were also necessary because the Jews had nowhere else to go. They had no refuge. That in Europe, there was no rescue coming for them, and everywhere there was a door, it was a door without a handle. But perhaps it is the story about Walter Benjamin that tells the story best. Walter Benjamin was born to a wealthy, assimilated German-Jewish family in the late 1800s. His father was a prominent banker. His uncle was William Stern, who founded the concept of the IQ. He himself would develop into an eclectic intellect, highly respected as an historian, philosopher, and art critic. While in university, he began to discover about Judaism and Zionism, but because he was such a proud German citizen, he declared his belief that Jewish ideas alone would create a unique and safe place for Jews to live in. He called it cultural Zionism, and that Jews didn't need a physical space in which to live. As the politics of Germany began to turn against the Jews, Walter Benjamin escaped to Spain. And when that turned fascist, he escaped to Paris. And when Paris fell into the Vichy government, he escaped to southern France. It was there that he obtained a visa to the United States. But in order to use that visa, he needed a French transit visa, which he got too. On the day Walter Benjamin was supposed to leave, as a result of pressure from the German authorities, all of the transit visas were canceled. That morning, facing the train station he was supposed to have left, Walter Benjamin committed suicide. Which is to say that Walter Benjamin certainly realized that his earlier theory was very wrong, that ideas are not enough. Jews need space. As I said earlier, if the great Talmudist Shaul Lieberman was right, about the Bible being such a small book, which it is compared to the Talmud, that certainly cannot be said of the letters, words, and books that were written about it and for it. One such school of books was an entire enterprise of translating the Torah into a language that people who didn't understand Hebrew could easily open it up and read it and learn it. The project that is most well known is when the Hebrew Bible was translated into Greek, which opened the door for millions of Greek-speaking Jews and non-Jews to begin to learn it and understand it. But in fact, a few hundred years before, the project of translating it was into Aramaic, which was the Yiddish of the ancient Jewish world. The person responsible for that project was a Roman convert to Judaism named Aquilin, whose name in Hebrew was transposed as Onkelos. Better known to Jewish students throughout the world as Uncle Louis. His translation is the gold standard par excellence. The opening of the Torah portion for this morning describes the naming and accounting of all the tribes in the desert with the word. The opening word is naso. Most translations translate the word naso as meaning to count all the tribes. But Onkelos doesn't translate the word naso as to count. Onkelos translates the word as in take them all in. All the Jews in the desert, all those who wander, leave no one behind. During the 1973 Yom Kippur War that nearly destroyed Israel, then Prime Minister Golda Meir visited the troops at the front, and she was asked, to all the troops that are there, she said, "Is there anyone who would like to ask me something?" And one of them raised his hand. His face, there's actually a picture of it. His face was caked in basalt, in dark basalt from the tank battles. And you could only see the whites of his eyes. And he says, "I have a question." He said, "My father was killed in the war in 48. And we won that war. And my uncle was killed in the war of 56, and we won that war too. And my brother lost an arm in the 67 war, and we won that. And last week I lost my best friend, and we will win this war too. But is our sacrifice worth it?" And this is what she answered him. She said, "In 1948, I was sent to Moscow as the first ambassador of Israel to the Soviet Union. And Stalinism was at its height. Jews had no rights as Jews because Stalin had proclaimed war against Judaism. Zionism was a crime. Hebrew was banned. Torah study was banned. You could be sent to a gulag or to Siberia for far less. Our first Shabbat, I arrived in Moscow. I went to services at the great synagogue there, and it was practically empty. But the news of our arrival in Moscow spread quickly, so that the next Shabbat when I went, the street in front of the shul was jam-packed. Close to 50,000 people were waiting for us. Old people and teenagers, babies in their parents' arms, even men in army uniforms. Despite all the risks, despite all the official threats to stay away, these Jews had come out from everywhere to demonstrate their kinship with us. And inside the shul, she said, it was the exact same. Without speeches or parades, the Jews were showing their love for Israel and the Jewish people, and she said, I was the symbol. I prayed with them that morning, and the people at the end surged around me, stretching their hands and crying out, Shalom Aleichem Golda. Welcome, Golda. Golda, Leben Zotzu. Golda, you should have a long life. And all I could think over and over to say to them was, Adechen vos geleben Yidden. I thank you for remaining Jews. And then they cried back and said, Mir danken Medinas Yisrael. We thank the state of Israel. And Golda finished the story by telling the soldiers, that is how I know the sacrifice is worth it. It was true then. And this past week, we read again just how true it continues to be. Shabbat Shalom.